Welcome to T-Now Physics, and this morning I'm going to go over the phenomena of diffraction. This phenomena is very individual to waves. Only waves can diffract, and that is an important thing to remember for much later on when we talk about wave-particle duality, but only waves can diffract. Now, diffraction is basically known as the spreading out of waves when going through a gap. So when waves reach a gap, they spread out. And you see this phenomena if you go down to a river. Water flows through, you have a gap, and as the water goes through the gap, the ripples that it creates at the other side can vary depending on the size of the gap. That is diffraction. It's the spreading out of waves. And there are three very important situations that you need to be aware of, comparing the size of the gap to the wavelength itself. When the gap is smaller than the wavelength, when the gap is equal to the wavelength, and when the gap is much, much bigger than the wavelength. So I'm going to start here. When the gap is much, much bigger than the wavelength, you see very negligible diffraction effects. So the wave doesn't spread out. The wave carries on like nothing is happening. You may see a little bit of diffraction around the corners, but it's so negligible we just say it doesn't really happen. So we basically say that the wave is unaffected. In fact, it will move through and nothing will happen. This is the important boundary when the gap is equal to the wavelength. This is when you start seeing noticeable diffraction effects. When you start seeing curves in the wave, this idea that the wave is coming in straight but leaving spread out. As that gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller to the wavelength, diffraction gets far more noticeable. And you start having these very large areas of diffraction. There's a really massive diffraction effect here. It's really important in an exam that you're able to draw these, know what diffraction is, and be able to relate the gap size and the wavelength and how much diffraction would really happen.